Victoria Blake's day began before sunrise. As it always did, at 26 years old, she had already perfected the rhythm of invisibility, a rhythm that suited the quiet corners of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. She tied her auburn hair back into a simple ponytail, the strands tucked neatly away, so they never brushed her sharp brown eyes. Her uniform bore no marks of distinction, just the standard coveralls of a range maintenance tech. Boots struck the gravel in an even cadence as she carried her battered supply bag across the compound. Unnoticed by the SEALs finishing their morning run, they laughed and traded jabs as they jogged past, but their eyes slid over her as if she were a shadow stretched across the tarmac. At the ranges, she worked with steady precision. Brass littered the firing lanes, thin cylinders that gleamed gold in the light. She knelt and swept them into a canvas bucket, the motion practiced and quick. Targets on wooden stands hung shredded and bent from yesterday's drills. She patched them with clean sheets, stapling through splintered wood until each was reset. Ammunition crates had to be logged, cleaned, and redistributed. She did all of it without complaint, her face calm, expression giving away nothing. Around her, the SEALs trained in close teams, their weapons cracking in steady cadence. They barked commands, adjusted angles, and moved in patterns that filled the air with confidence. She moved between them like part of the furniture, a figure expected but never acknowledged. When jokes did come, they carried the casual cruelty of men, certain she posed no threat. One muttered that the cleaning girl worked faster than the brass collectors. Another asked if she wanted to polish his rifle while she was at it. She heard the words but never looked up. Silence was her armor. Her hands never faltered on the stapler or the broom. They could not know that every casing she swept up was weighed in her mind, every firing lane recorded with the precision of a shooter trained since childhood. Tucked inside her vest pocket was the one object she allowed herself, a battered notebook her grandfather had given her. Its corners were curled, the spine cracked, and the pages filled with dope charts written in his sharp hand. He had been a sniper in Vietnam. Master Sergeant David Blake, a name whispered in special forces circles. He carried 134 confirmed kills, though he had spoken of none of them with pride. To Victoria, he had spoken only of patience, of the silence that lived between breaths. He taught her to read the way wind tugged at a grass blade or rippled water across a pond. He made her mark bullet drop with chalk lines against barn siding, drilling into her the truth that math mattered as much as the trigger. He called her little bird and told her the rifle was never the weapon. The mind was. Those memories carried her through the monotony of Coronado. When she patched targets, she remembered standing with him in Montana fields, watching mirage dance above the earth. When she swept brass, she remembered calculating range and angle on a hillside where he had made her track a moving coyote across wind shear. She knew she could outshoot most of the men who ignored her. But proving it was impossible in a system that had already decided her role, recruiters had once told her she would do better in logistics or intelligence, anywhere but behind a rifle. Even when her test scores had shattered records, the doors remained closed. So she built her own training ground in secret. Off-duty, she drove to civilian ranges, slipping beneath the radar, entering competitions under false names. She studied the wind off desert ridges, the effect of ocean air across valley lines, the way humidity warped trajectory in summer heat. The notebook grew heavier with each year, filled with her own tight script alongside her grandfather's notes. No one at Coronado knew it existed. No one cared enough to ask what she carried in her vest. Each morning she returned to the range, and each morning the cycle repeated. Brass, targets, ammunition. She existed as a shadow, at the edges of men, convinced they owned the sun, yet her eyes missed nothing. She logged muzzle discipline, firing cadence, reaction times. She memorized their tactical procedures without ever being briefed. If any of them had looked close enough, they might have seen how she paused at the firing line, reading wind off the flags before replacing the targets. They might have seen how she studied the shimmer above the berm, tracing the mirage patterns that would ruin a long shot, but none of them looked The silence of her days hardened into something else. A quiet resilience born of being unseen. Victoria never fought the invisibility. She folded it around her like a cloak, letting the world think she was nothing more than the girl who patched targets. Yet in that silence, she carried the weight of knowledge others had chosen to dismiss. Greatness. She was learning. Could hide in plain sight for years if no one bothered to believe it belonged there. She was invisible, but she was ready. The morning had opened like any other training day at Coronado. The range was hot with noise. Bursts of controlled fire echoing off the concrete structures that had been built to mimic a dense city block. Commander Ryan Patterson moved with his SEAL platoon through the mock alleys, checking angles and calling cadence. They were running a live-fire urban warfare drill, the kind meant to sharpen reflexes before deployment. Victoria Blake was nowhere near the center of that world. She was at the far edge of the range, kneeling by the 800-meter line, stapling a fresh target to a board splintered from weeks of use. Her auburn hair was tied tight. Her eyes narrowed in the haze. To her, it was just another morning of patching and cleaning. The endless cycle of invisibility. Then the first mortar landed. It struck the administration building just beyond the training lanes, the explosion shaking the ground so hard that dirt and shrapnel spat across her boots. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Patterson thought it was an accident, maybe a misfire. But the second round landed closer, followed by a third that threw smoke across the open yard. Gunfire erupted from the hills surrounding the base, sharp cracks echoing in controlled rhythm. It was not a drill. Victoria dropped flat, her cheek pressed against the earth. She felt the concussion before she registered the sound. All around her, the platoon scattered for cover, shouting into radios, scanning rooftops that moments earlier had been nothing but props. Patterson's voice cut across comms, tight and urgent, calling contact left. Multiple shooters, possible heavy weapons. A dozen scenarios raced through his mind. But only one fact mattered. They were under real attack. The SEALs scrambled behind barriers and half-collapsed walls. 2 men were hit almost instantly. Williams, their designated marksman, took a round through the shoulder and dropped his rifle with a curse. Thompson, the communications specialist, was bleeding heavily from shrapnel in his legs. Patterson cursed under his breath, counting bodies and weapons, realizing his platoon had been pinned in the open. Enemy snipers had high ground on 3 sides, muzzle flashes winking like taunts in the smoke. He barked for a quick reaction force, but the answer came cold over the net. Reinforcements were at least 15 minutes out. 15 minutes might as well have been forever. Panic threaded through the squad. Radio chatter overlapped, clipped voices announcing positions and shouting for cover fire. Bullets struck concrete and metal with terrifying precision. Patterson knew the enemy had studied them, knew exactly when the drills would run and how to trap them in the open. He saw fear in the younger men's eyes as they hugged cover, rifles useless against angles they could not see. The training ground had become a kill box in less than 2 minutes. Through the chaos, Victoria moved differently. She had not sprinted for the bunkers with the others. Instead, she slid behind the low berm that marked the range's edge and lifted her head just enough to read the hills. She tracked the pattern of the muzzle flashes, noting their spread, timing the rhythm between bursts. Instinct sharpened into calculation. Distance, wind drift, elevation. She had measured them all 1,000 times in silence. And now the numbers came unbidden. Her grandfather's notebook rested in her vest pocket, but she did not need it. The math lived inside her. She spotted the first sniper position at 2 o'clock. Elevation, roughly 600 meters. Firing angle down the slope. Another was farther west, mirrored against a rock outcropping. Machine gun fire hammered from a dug-in nest just below them. Cutting across the lanes, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice reminding her that the rifle was only a tool. The mind was the weapon. She steadied her breathing even as the ground shook from another mortar blast. Patterson ducked behind a barrier, scanning his men. He saw Thompson pale with blood loss, Williams clutching his useless arm, and the rest firing blindly just to keep heads down. His gut clenched. 15 minutes was an eternity. They would not last half that. He tried to rally them. But the truth pressed against him without precision fire. They were being bled out. One man at a time. Victoria's calm contrasted like night against day. She low-crawled across the dirt toward the storage shed at the edge of the range, moving with a precision that looked drilled rather than improvised. Patterson glimpsed her through smoke and almost shouted for her to stop. But another burst of fire pinned him flat. When he looked again, she had reached the shed and disappeared inside. He wondered if panic had finally driven her to hide, but she emerged with a rifle case in her hands. It was the Mark 11, the same platform Williams had been using before he went down. She held it steady as she scanned for elevation. Not running. Not cowering. Her posture was all wrong for a cleaning girl. It was right for a shooter. Patterson's chest tightened as realization clashed with disbelief. She should have been frozen in fear like the others. Instead, she looked calm, calculating, as if the attack had shifted her into the one place she had always belonged. Smoke thickened. Radios skrämd. And the sky thundered with the promise of more mortar fire. Patterson knew his team was bleeding time. Around him, panic gnawed at discipline. But at the edge of the chaos, Victoria Blake remained steady. Her eyes locked on the hills, mind turning over angles and drift as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. In crisis, status meant nothing. Only competence survived. And hers was beginning to cut through the noise. Commander Ryan Patterson saw her silhouette through the drifting smoke and for a second thought his mind had broken under the pressure. Victoria Blake, the quiet range tech who patched targets and swept brass, was crawling through fire with a Mark 11 sniper rifle locked in her hands. She moved with the deliberate rhythm of someone who had drilled every motion, not the flailing of a civilian caught in chaos. He shouted across the gunfire, his voice torn raw. "Blake, what the hell do you think you're doing?" She paused only long enough to meet his eyes across the open ground. Dirt streaked her cheek, but her expression was calm, almost cold. "Commander, I can neutralize their sniper positions," she said. "I need Williams' scope and his radio frequency." The words came sharp, confident, delivered like a briefing. For a heartbeat, he simply stared. The rifle fire snapping past his head, the wounded crying out. It was madness. She was maintenance staff, a civilian asset, not a trained operator. "You can't be serious." He barked back. "You are not qualified. You'll get yourself killed." Her tone did not shift. "Sir, your sniper is down. Your commsmen can't move. And you're out of time. Reinforcements are 15 minutes away. At this rate, you won't have a team left to save." The cold certainty of her words hit harder than the gunfire. Patterson's training screamed against it. He had built a career on discipline, procedure, and trust in qualification. And yet, when he looked at her, he saw no fear, only calculation. She had already begun scanning the hillside, mapping the geometry of fire. His gut clenched with the knowledge that she might be right. Petty Officer Williams groaned nearby, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His spotting scope lay half buried in dirt, his radio headset dangling useless. He heard the exchange and spat out a breath. "Commander, she doesn't know the call-outs. You hand her my kit. We're done." Victoria turned her head toward him. Voice steady. Elevation 600. Wind at 30 degrees. Your first shooter is dug in at 2 o'clock. Center mass on the ridge. Second position is mirrored west. Fires bracketed. Staggered in 20-second intervals. I can break it. Williams froze, his mouth half open. Those were the numbers he had been muttering before the round took him down. He glanced at Patterson, then back at her. The skepticism remained. But so did something else. Recognition. Patterson weighed everything in the space of seconds. Doctrine said civilians were liabilities. Reality said his men were dying while an enemy sniper line cut them to pieces. He felt the old lesson pounding in his skull: leadership is not about rules. It is about survival. He crawled to Williams and grabbed the scope. "Give her the headset," he ordered. Williams swore under his breath, but pulled it free with his good hand and tossed it toward her. She caught it clean, not fumbling. Then slung the scope across her shoulder as if she had done it 100 times. The Mark 11 sat in her grip like it had grown there. Patterson leaned close, voice low but hard. "Blake, if you can't do this, tell me now. I will not watch you die trying to play soldier." Her eyes locked on his, brown and unshaken. "Commander, trust me. This is what I was born to do." Something in the tone chilled him more than the fight itself. Not bravado, not desperation certainty. He had heard that voice in combat before, in the men who knew they could walk into fire and come out whole, against every instinct he carried. He nodded once. Around them, the platoon had gone quiet. The unspoken disbelief heavier than the smoke. A maintenance worker had just been handed their sniper's tools, and the commander's approval. One young SEAL muttered under his breath, "This is insane." Another shook his head, anger and fear lacing his voice. "She's not one of us." Patterson cut them off with a glare that brooked no argument. "She's what we've got. You want to live. You cover her ascent." The choice had been made. Victoria slid the headset on, adjusted the dial with sure fingers, and chambered around. Her posture was exact, efficient, nothing wasted. She looked once toward the observation tower that loomed above the range, its steel frame exposed against the sky. That was where she was headed. Patterson felt the weight of command in a new way. Trust was never easy. But now it stretched to the breaking point. He had just placed the fate of his entire platoon in the hands of a woman none of them had ever seen as more than background. And yet, in his gut, he knew it was the only gamble left. The Mark 11 gleamed dull in the smoke as she shouldered it. Williams lay back against the barrier, his face twisted with pain, but his voice low. "God help us if she's wrong." Victoria did not answer. She simply moved, low and steady, toward the base of the tower. The rifle balanced across her arms. The scope clutched like an extension of her mind. Behind her, the men shifted uneasily, pinned between disbelief and hope. Patterson kept his eyes on her silhouette, every nerve alive with the weight of his choice. In that moment, hierarchy and training no longer mattered. The battlefield had stripped them down to a single truth: only competence counted. And the cleaning girl was about to prove whether she carried it. Victoria reached the base of the tower and pressed herself against the steel ladder. The frame rattled under the percussion of nearby fire, bolts shaking loose grit onto her hair. She tested the first rung with her boot and began to climb, slow and exact. Every step was a calculated exposure. Rounds hissed through the smoke, striking metal with sharp rings. But she kept moving. Patterson watched from below, his gut tight with the knowledge that no operator in his platoon would have dared that climb under such open fire. She never hesitated. At the platform, she slid across the planks, keeping her body low, rifle hugged tight. The Mark 11 lay against her shoulder as though it belonged there, the weight perfectly balanced. She set the bipod against the ledge and aligned the scope, her hands moving in practice sequence. Safety check, wind call, elevation dial, her battered notebook pressed inside her vest, untouched. But its lessons filled her every motion. Her first target was the sniper at 2 o'clock. 600 meters out. She exhaled, narrowed her world to a single reticle, and pressed the trigger. The crack split the air, down on the ridge. The enemy sniper's body dropped instantly, his rifle tumbling from the perch. Patterson's breath caught in his throat. Around him, stunned, SEALs glanced at one another as though trying to confirm what they had seen. She shifted smoothly, scope drifting west. The second sniper had already fired 3 suppressive bursts and was repositioning. She tracked him, adjusted a fraction for drift, and squeezed. The man fell before he settled back into cover. 2 shots, 2 kills. The third shot demanded more. A machine gunner crouched behind a half-broken barrier, the weapon hammering bursts that shredded their cover. Distance 750 meters. Partial concealment. Victoria adjusted for bullet drop, factored the angle of fire through concrete, and took the shot. The gunner collapsed sideways, weapon falling silent. Relief rippled across the PIN squad as the suppressive fire ceased. Up in the tower, she kept her breathing steady. Wind whispered across her cheek. She shifted again, locating 2 figures moving in tandem, feeding coordinates to the mortar crews that had hammered them from the start. She tracked the first handle, predicted his lean, and fired. Before the echo faded, she rolled the rifle, chambered again, and caught the second mid-stride. Both spotters crumpled into the dirt. Mortar fire stuttered, lost without its guides. 5 down. Smoke shifted as silence edged into the battlefield. For the first time since the attack began, Patterson felt possibility. Victoria held still, eyes sweeping for the last shooter. A flicker caught her edge vision. Muzzle flash, low on the eastern ridge. She steadied, dialing in with surgical patience. The sniper was careful, moving between shadows, firing only when certain. She matched his rhythm, waited for the pause, and pressed her trigger with the calm certainty of memory. The shot struck clean. The final threat folded into the brush. 6 shots. 6 dead. She eased her cheek from the stock, breathing once. Slow. Her posture never wavered. Below, the platoon stared upward. No one spoke. Patterson lowered his binoculars. Every assumption he had held about her dissolving in the span of minutes, she had not changed in that tower. She had simply revealed what had always been there. Victoria locked the safety, pulled the bolt back with methodical precision, and scanned once more to confirm no further movement. Then she leaned back against the platform, face calm, rifle across her knees, her grandfather's notebook pressed against her chest. Silent proof that the knowledge she carried had not been given by the Navy, but inherited, practiced, and sharpened in silence. For Patterson, awe mixed with disbelief. He had built his career on the conviction that excellence was born through the institution, yet here was proof that greatness had been sweeping their brass for 2 years. Around him, his men whispered, not with derision now, but with shock. They had seen skill that no qualification board could deny. On the tower, Victoria adjusted her headset and spoke with the same quiet tone she had used to ask for the rifle. Overwatch to ground. 6 confirmed. Remaining hostiles appear to be withdrawing. Recommend pursuit if assets are available. Her voice was steady, professional. Unshaken. She might as well have been one of them all along. The truth was undeniable now. The cleaning girl had become the only reason they were still alive. The range had fallen silent, except for the distant thrum of helicopters bringing the quick reaction force. Smoke curled along the hills where the last muzzle flashes had died. The SEAL platoon, still crouched behind shattered barriers, lifted their heads slowly, as if testing whether the nightmare had truly ended. Patterson lowered his rifle and let out a breath that tasted of ash. They were alive, but not because of him. All eyes tilted upward to the tower where Victoria Blake knelt, with the Mark 11 resting across her knees. The image of calm precision against the haze. When she began to climb down, the silence deepened. Boots thudded on the ladder, one careful step after another. The rifle remained slung tight, handled with reverence. No one spoke. The men who had spent 2 years ignoring her now watched as though she had stepped out of another world. Patterson met her at the base, his face drawn, eyes searching for the words that refused to come. She placed the rifle in his hands with quiet finality. as if returning property she had only borrowed. "I just did what needed to be done," she said softly. The line carried more weight than any after-action report. Williams, pale and bloodied, leaned against the barrier and stared at her. "How did you even know those angles? 6 clean shots, that's not luck." His voice cracked between disbelief and gratitude. Victoria's gaze did not waver. "My grandfather taught me, Master Sergeant David Blake, Special Forces sniper in Vietnam. He made sure I learned what the manuals left out." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Even the youngest among them had heard whispers of the legend. 134 confirmed kills. Stories passed in training rooms about impossible shots and patience beyond reason. For a moment, the men seemed to see her not as the woman who patched their targets, but as the inheritor of a lineage they revered. Some shifted uncomfortably, whispering low. One muttered that she had saved every man on the range. Another shook his head, ashamed at how often they had laughed at her silence. Respect came reluctantly, edged with unease. It was not easy to reconcile the invisible figure who swept brass with the marksman who had dismantled an assault. Patterson studied Hare, still gripping the rifle she had handed back. He asked, "Why didn't you ever tell us what you could do?" Her answer was quiet, steady. "When would I have you never asked? To you, I was only the cleaning girl. Nobody wanted to know what else I carried." The words hung heavy. The men shifted, avoiding her eyes, the truth pressing into them harder than the battle had. 2 years of dismissal, erased in 20 minutes of fire. Patterson looked at the rifle, then at the faint outline of a notebook peeking from her vest pocket. He realized it held the calculations and lessons she had been denied the chance to prove. The QRF poured into the compound then, shouting orders, securing perimeters. But the moment belonged only to them. Recognition had arrived. Not triumphant, not celebratory, but reluctant, uneasy, undeniable. They had overlooked her for years. Now they could not unsee her. The smoke had cleared from the range by the time the after-action reports reached command. What should have been a routine training cycle now sat inside a locked folder stamped classified. Senior officers read the pages in silence, their brows furrowed as if the paper itself accused them. The language of the report was clinical. Yet, underneath every line, pulsed a question no one wanted to voice. How had a maintenance technician, invisible on rosters, carried out a precision engagement worthy of the most elite sniper programs in the operations wing? The report passed hand to hand. Some read it twice, frowning at the exactness of the kill sequence. 6 targets, 6 confirmed eliminations, executed under pressure, with no comms net to guide her. The description sounded like a case study pulled from a textbook, but there were no textbooks that listed Victoria Blake as a student. The longer they studied it, the more uncomfortable the silence grew. Commander Ryan Patterson filed his recommendation at once, breaking protocol by sending it straight to higher authority. He wrote it in blunt language, not polished for boards or committees. "She didn't just save my team." The line read, "She taught us how blind we've been." The weight of his words unsettled some, impressed others, but no one could dismiss them. His team was alive because of her, and that fact resisted bureaucratic spin. Victoria herself avoided the swirl that followed. She continued to walk the range quietly, sweeping brass and patching targets, her battered notebook still in her vest pocket. She never volunteered for attention, never raised her voice in the meetings where her name was suddenly whispered. Around here, sailors stared a little longer, their expressions caught between gratitude and unease. It was easier to pretend nothing had changed. Yet everyone knew it had. In hushed conference rooms, senior commanders debated whether her presence represented an anomaly or an untapped opportunity. Some argued she was a rare exception, a curiosity that could not be institutionalized. Others, fewer but louder, insisted her case revealed a flaw in the system itself, proof that talent could be buried beneath bias, until crisis dragged it into the open. The debates ended with no resolution, only the uneasy knowledge that her file would not disappear. On the roster board in the ready room, her call sign appeared in pencil one morning. Faint, tentative, but there, ghost. No announcement accompanied it. No formal acknowledgement. Just a name pressed into graphite, like someone testing whether it belonged. The younger sailors glanced at it with quiet respect. The older ones avoided looking. The official file labeled her actions as exemplary unsanctioned engagement and logged the sequence as a case study for review. Yet, in the margins of conversation, in the way Patterson carried himself when her name was mentioned, the truth lingered. Competence had forced itself into the open, leaving the institution no choice but to adjust, even when reluctant, even when embarrassed. Change had begun. 6 months later, the training grounds at Coronado carried a different rhythm. The laughter and dismissive glances that once followed Victoria Blake were gone. Now, she walked the firing line in uniform, her rank stitched clean on her chest, her presence carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place the hardest way possible. Lieutenant Victoria Ghost Blake had been given command of the Navy's Advanced Sniper Training Program, and every seat in her classroom filled before the bell. The students came from across the services, young men and women with reputations already forming ENDA. But when she spoke, the room stilled. They listened as she described not only marksmanship but patience, the art of wind reading, the subtle calculations that could never be trusted entirely to a computer. She spoke of discipline, of stillness, of how the greatest shots were often the ones never taken. Each lesson carried the weight of a legacy older than any of them. On her desk rested her grandfather's battered notebook. Page frayée. Ink faded but legible. She opened it at times to show the margins filled with wind calls, elevation tables, and sketches of ranges drawn by hand. The recruits leaned forward as if the book itself were sacred. She never dramatized it, never told long stories. She simply let the pages stand as proof that preparation outlasted recognition. Whispers still moved through the halls. Coronado. The day the cleaning girl picked up a rifle and saved a platoon. It was no longer a rumor, but a legend folded into their instruction, recited in low voices with the awe of myth. Patterson visited occasionally, standing at the back of the range with arms crossed. His expression, carrying pride, muted by restraint. He never interrupted her sessions, never took credit. He simply watched, a reminder of the moment he chose to trust. Victoria no longer lived in the shadow of invisibility. Her students saw her clearly, and in their focus, she found a quiet vindication. She had not changed. Only the eyes around her had finally opened. Legacy, she understood, was not found in medals or reports. It lived in the shooters she prepared, in the patience she passed on, in the silence that had once hidden her, now shaping the next generation.